Welcome everyone to this public online teach-in on the topic of capital and history, hosted by the Melbourne chapter of the Platypus Affiliated Society. The Platypus Affiliated Society was established in 2006 in Chicago and organizes reading groups, public fora, research and journalism based on problems and tasks inherited from the old left of the 1920s to 1930s, the new left of the 1960s to 1970s, and the post-political left of the 1980s to 1990s. All for the possibility of emancipatory politics today. You can learn more about our activities on Facebook and Instagram through @platypusmelbourne or by visiting our website www.platypus1917.org or through our podcast titled Shit Platypus Says, which can be streamed on SoundCloud. We also have a monthly open access publication called the Platypus Review. Next month, we are hosting 2 public panel discussions. This Tuesday, November 2nd, online via Zoom, a panel on coronavirus and the left, discussing the relationship between the dual crises of the pandemic and of neoliberalism. Then on Saturday, November 14th, in person at the New International Bookstore in Carlton, a panel on the Australian Labor Party and the Marxist left. Tickets or attendance are extremely limited due to indoor restrictions, but the event will be streamed live on Zoom as well. Platypus also runs a reading group where we go through a yearly syllabus from Rousseau to Marx to Lenin to Adorno, trying to understand what Marxism was. There are 2 streams of this reading group running concurrently. One stream meets in person on Mondays at 6:30 p.m. at the Clyde Hotel in Carlton, run by myself, Ryan. And there's also a stream meeting online via Zoom on Wednesday nights from 8 p.m. for Australia-wide participation. Next week's reading group sessions cover the Marx's 1844 Paris manuscripts and the Manifesto of the Communist Party. Today's teach-in will be presented by Platypus member Liam Kenny, who also runs the online reading group stream on Wednesdays. This teach-in will go for approximately 20 minutes, after which there'll be an hour or so of questions and discussion. With that, I'll hand it over to Liam.
Thank you, Ryan. Thanks for coming, everyone. Just a word about the method of presentation. Yeah, we are doing this teaching on Zoom as I help to run the online reading group that's Australia-wide. Going forward, as we're out of lockdown now, we hope to do more teach-ins in the real world, so to speak. All right, so I'll launch into it. As Ryan says, I'll talk for about 20 minutes. I've got it all written down. And then after that, we'll have a chat. So when the art critic John Berger was asked in 2011 why he still called himself a Marxist, he replied that reading Marx, quote, helped me enormously to understand history and therefore to understand where we are in history. With this answer, Berger helpfully puts the category of history front and center in the question of what Marxism is or was, as opposed to the category of mere economics or philosophy. In the following, I'll try to present a basic understanding of what history meant for Marxism. That is what the critical theory of Marx, Engels, and later Marxists said about where capital is situated in history and how the potential of history presents itself to be realized in society through conditions of capital. I will try to point to the specificity of capitalism as it appears in the course of human events, as well as the way history appears from the standpoint of the society of capital. So I'll begin by reading a passage from Karl Marx from the notebooks posthumously published as the Grundrisse, or the Fundamentals, from 1857 to 8, which is as follows, quote, the ancient conception in which man always appears in however narrowly national, religious, or political a definition as the aim of production, seems very much more exalted than the modern world, in which production is the aim of man and wealth the aim of production. In fact, however, when the narrow bourgeois form has been peeled away, what is wealth, if not the universality of needs, capacities, enjoyments, productive powers, etc., of individuals produced in universal exchange? What, if not the full development of human control over the forces of nature, those of his own nature, as well as those of so-called nature? What, if not the absolute elaboration of his creative dispositions, without any preconditions other than antecedent historical evolution, which make the totality of this evolution, i.e. the evolution of all human powers as such, unmeasured by any previously established yardstick, an end in itself? What is this, if not a situation where man does not reproduce in any determined form, but produces his totality, where he does not seek to remain something formed by the past, but is in the absolute movement of becoming? In bourgeois political economy, and in the epoch of production to which it corresponds, this complete elaboration of what lies within man appears as the total alienation and the destruction of all fixed one-sided purposes as the sacrifice of the end in itself to a wholly external compulsion. Hence, in one way, the childlike world of the ancients appears to be superior, and this is so, insofar as we seek for closed shape, form, and established limitation. The ancients provide a narrow satisfaction, whereas the modern world leaves us unsatisfied, or where it appears to be satisfied with itself is vulgar and mean, end quote. So Marx here elaborates an idea of human self-mastery or freedom as a project situated in an open-ended becoming in distinction to being, where ancient freedom was conceived as the freedom to be who we are. Modern freedom is the freedom to become other than ourselves. The realization of what is complexified with the possibility of what could or should become. This ambivalent situation of modernity, wherein production has become an end in itself, has the potential to leave us restless and dissatisfied. And by Marx's time, when the process is almost completely slipped out of humanity's conscious control, it becomes more dangerous and acutely characterized by the suffering that defines squandered potential. The task of regaining control over this condition is the task of history as it presents itself in capital. So I'll say a bit about history. Our understanding of history is necessarily our theory of the present. When we theorize about what it is that distinguishes our present condition, we are specifying, consciously or not, the trends and facts of history that bear down on us. When Marxism claims that the social mode of being and becoming that we call capitalism is unprecedented in human history, and therefore that any emancipation beyond it would be just as unprecedented, it is presenting a vision that centers the society of capital as, at least potentially, world historically transitory. Platypus adopts what it calls a left-centric perspective on this history. Here, the left is understood as that tendency in bourgeois society which strives for the conscious grasp of potential and possibility for emancipation through history. This utopian character of the left is as opposed to resignation to the horizons of the present, a stance which characterizes the right, which would include fights against oppression, which the right also claim in their own way. An understanding of history that centers the left means, to quote Chris Catrone of Platypus, quote, "We hypothesize that the most important determinations of the present are the result of what the left has done or failed to do historically," end quote. This framing is meanwhile bound up with the coming into being of a society dominated by the logic of capital. The left as such, as Platypus understands it, is tasked with cognizing and grasping the potential for freedom in and through capitalist society. For this to make sense, we need to define what we mean when we talk about such a society. I'm going to start sharing my screen now for a Platypus resource, which is this timeline of capital and history. I will talk about this in a bit, but I'll just say a bit more first. So we can begin defining capitalist society by recognizing that the phrase itself can be misleading. Capitalism, for Marxism, is most usefully understood not as a form of society as such, but as the internal crisis of bourgeois society. To define what we mean by that, it will help to take a long view of human history. Very broadly, we can say that around 12,000 years ago, humanity went through what, from our perspective, can be considered its first major crisis in what we call the Neolithic Revolution. People that we now call hunter-gatherers, for some reason or another, went from primarily living a nomadic existence to settling in one place and engaging in agriculture to sustain and reproduce themselves. For the purposes of our timeline, we can call what was born here traditional civilization. Traditional civilization, from our perspective in modernity, may as well be one big thing. There was, of course, all kinds of dynamism in these centuries. The world of humanity was as diverse here as it ever has been. What matters for us, though, and what makes traditional civilization into a sensible category, is that human history, in its self-understanding and practices, goes through a transformation equally as profound as the agricultural one, which fundamentally overhauls human beings' relations to themselves, to others, and to nature. This transformation, which we may still be experiencing, we can call the Bourgeois Revolution. What characterizes the Bourgeois Revolution, in the most basic sense, is the revolt of the third estate. That is, as opposed to the first estate, the clergy, and the second estate, the nobility. The third estate, the common townspeople, who possess no property but their own capacity to labor, advanced the notion that they would relate to one another on the basis of this labor. They rejected the great chain of being, under which every soul was assigned its lot at birth, and sought a new social relation upon which they could create meaning for themselves on the basis of the free and fair exchange of their own abilities. Deciding who got what in this new social order would, at least as a general rule, not be the traditional hierarchy dominated by the clergy and nobility, but common exchange. It is the profound global implication of this change in society's self-conception and activity that led the Marxist critical theorist Theodor Adorno to claim that society as such is, quote, a concept of the third estate. In this, Adorno was following Marx himself, who had said that England was the site of, quote, the demiurge of the bourgeois cosmos. In other words, the coming into being of the universe. So I thought I had been sharing the screen for the last little bit, but it told me it paused the screen sharing because I switched back to my Word document. So imagine this had been up the whole time. We've been talking about the revolution from ancient to traditional civilization through to the time of the third estate, the workers, modernity in the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s. It's worth mentioning categories up the top here. We might say that in bourgeois society, certain practices and concepts come into their own. So we have art becomes about art in a certain sense. Obviously a scientific revolution, a religious revolution, the Reformation, political forms, and philosophy becomes critical philosophy. Philosophy becomes about philosophy in a certain way, as well as being about practice. But all of these concepts and practices become self-reflexive in a way that they weren't previously. So if the bourgeois revolution represents a process where these concepts and practices come into their own, they also represent a point of crisis for them. Bourgeois society is radically open-ended. It appears as the culmination of civilization while carrying the potential to go beyond it. This ambivalence is related to the fact that, as Marx says in the Grundrisse passage, the aim of humanity in the modern world becomes production. The political animal becomes the animal of productive efficiency. And this historically unprecedented mode of sustaining existence and producing surplus harbors unprecedented, unrealized potential. For Marx, however, the potential for both progress and regress in this state of becoming was not made particularly acute until another kind of revolution, which for Marx is what really throws the concepts and practices of bourgeois society into a crisis with more profound world historic implications. This is what we call the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th and early 19th century, where machinery and technology revolutionized the industrial manufacturing process. For Marx, the Industrial Revolution takes the most significant qualitative change in humanity in history, the demiurge of the bourgeois cosmos, and radically deepens its ambivalence, its danger, and possibilities. In and through the Industrial Revolution, the potential contained in this form of society is most emphatically at stake, because social intercourse, typified by labor such as it is, enters into a state of self-contradiction with its own understanding and practice. The phenomenon of unemployment is the most perfect expression of this. The society of emancipated labor comes to be dominated and undermined by its own activity. And this dynamic creates new forms of radical politics and new modes of reaction. Social practice, still mediated by the logic of the exchange of labor, becomes at the same time subject to the logic of capital. So now I'll talk about capital. In the preface to his contribution to the Critique of Political Economy from 1859, Marx writes the following, quote, "At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Consciousness must be explained from the contradictions of material life, from the conflict existing between the social forces of production and the relations of production," end quote. By forces of production here, we can understand Marx to mean the potential in industry. By social relations, we should not understand merely private property or workplace exploitation, but the bottom-up society of labor in which we all participate and reproduce on a daily basis. Capital, as built up past labor, presses to minimize, if not abolish, living labor, not as a function of individual capitalists' greed, but of the compulsive necessity to re-establish value. For some of us to go to work, others have to be fired. For Marxists, this conflict begged to be mastered by society as a whole through the specific form of consciousness it produces, the class struggle. For Marx, capitalism was nothing if not the potential for socialism that could be unleashed by the industrial forces, but was constrained by social relations. Without the actuality of the consciousness of this potential, it is questionable whether we live in capitalism at all, as Marx understood it. Exploitation has characterized human relations since their dawn, and all kinds of societies have produced a social surplus above what is needed for immediate subsistence. What is specific to capital, and for Marxists what harbored potential in capital, is not exploitation or surplus, but domination. Domination of society as a whole by the logic of capital, by the logic of the historically moving contradiction between the social relations of labor and the potential of the industrial forces that are always outstripping those relations. In our practice every day as bourgeois subjects, i.e. subjects who engage in freely associative labor, we reconstitute this conflict daily by reproducing an eternal present at the expense of the potential future that is imminent to industry. In this way, bourgeois society is proletarianized. Class in this understanding then becomes a fundamentally historical category. Class is not simply a matter of the sociological groupings of owners and workers, but a way of recognizing the historical contradiction that defines capitalism as the simultaneous possibility of and undermining of socialism. The industrial proletariat is the industrial proletariat precisely because of this contradiction, whereby it becomes subject to the ever-present threat of unemployment, as preserving the value of capital comes into conflict with the need to keep people in work. The classes then are not the cause of the social dynamic we call capitalism, but their inevitable effect. To quote Chris Catronigan on this point, quote, "The propaganda of working class struggle politics by historical Marxism was mistaken in subsequent generations for theoretical substance, confusing cause and effect in capitalism. The self-contradiction of social value in production between wages and capital was mistaken for a conflict of interests between workers and capitalists, with the latter regarded merely as exploitative profiteers and not, as Marx saw them, as character masks of the greater social imperatives of capital. The workers were meant to replace the capitalist ruling class, not to do away with exploitation, but to make politically explicit and thus conscious the contradiction of capital," end quote. This was the meaning of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and explains why Marx considered his discovery of the necessity of it to be one of his only contributions to the theory of socialism. The dictatorship of the proletariat would not be socialism, but a transitory stage through capitalism, whereby the impossibility of putting everybody to work would be made conscious on a political and global level. Capitalism as the crisis of bourgeois society could only be overcome on the basis of that society for Marx. Furthermore, the workers' demand for the value of their labor was understood as the demand that reproduced bourgeois society's crisis. The self-contradiction of the workers' movement for socialism was this, that in asserting their labor rights, the laborers reconstituted their own domination. This problem demanded theoretical and political mediation. Marx's recognition of the struggle for freedom in history as necessarily imminent to the bourgeois society of labor in its crisis helps us to grasp many of the theoretical and practical standstills that have characterized politics for over a century. It explains why in capitalism, history seems to both progress and regress, why bourgeois or modern values in capitalism seem to both fulfill and negate themselves, why political victories on the left, including on the terrain of class struggle itself, seem only to reconstitute the dynamic stasis of capital, why it becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish between reactionary and progressive responses to the pathological repetitions and regressions of modernity. Consciously organized production, as understood by Marxism, was only the next link in the chain that might begin to take humanity beyond this impasse. Marxism set humanity the task of moving beyond what it called prehistory into a true beginning of human history. After the failure of the movement for socialism and the death of the left, the task remains in our future. And that's all I have written down. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Liam. That was really great. Yeah, the understanding of capital and history is fundamental to Marxism and thus is a central focus of the Platypus syllabus. And we spent a lot of time reading around this concept particularly. And certainly a question we hope to be addressing in the panel on Tuesday night on the coronavirus and the left. How does that relate to the era of capitalism? Hope to see some of you there. Shortly, we'll get into about an hour or so of questions and discussions. I'd like people to raise their hands and I'll take a speaking list. Please try to keep your questions to under 2 minutes to allow for many speakers. I'd also like to say that there's really no question too basic when it comes to these topics, as we precisely want to get to the most fundamental questions regarding capital, politics, freedom, history, class. All of these things, although pronounced as concrete, seem very mysterious in the present. So we want to really dig in, and any ambiguities we might have or questions about those topics are certainly welcome. So, and I particularly encourage audience members new to the left or to Marxism or to Platypus to ask questions. So anyone want to start us off with a question? Are people allowed to raise hands? Have I prohibited that as well? Yes, David, please go ahead.
Oops, sorry. Hey, yeah, so I'm kind of new. I just thought I'd come along and see what it's all about. Yeah, I guess I kind of find it interesting in terms of like, you know, individual agency. So I guess if you think about history, like it just seems like we have a conversation about history as this like abstract thing. But so I may not have got completely what Liam was saying, interpreted completely correctly here, but my kind of understanding of what sort of the argument Liam was making was that socialism isn't really sort of working because we don't sort of live under what Marx sort of his idea of what, you know, capitalism sort of was. When I think of that, I kind of think of, well, you know, that's kind of taking a very purist sort of perspective on like what capitalism was, you know, this sort of like pure, you know, pure, really, really pure capitalism. I guess if you sort of accept that argument, it's like it's not really based in sort of the real world. And I guess what I kind of think is you can't really, when I sort of think about it, you can't really sort of not think about an individual person's agency within that, because that is kind of like labor, like the labor that an individual puts into, I don't know, bringing about the revolution, or I guess you know, one of the things I was thinking sort of was that, well, if you accept that, then you know that the revolution is going to be inevitable. From if you accept pure capitalism, that's the only way to bring about the revolution, then it's just automatically going to happen, and therefore none of us need to do anything. We'll just sit here and wait for it to happen. But I don't think that's I don't think that's going to happen, because capitalism is kind of imposed upon us. We're living with it, and that's, you know, we have to, I guess the struggle against that is we kind of just have to respond to that. Because it's the first imposition of that, you know, on our lives in how we, you know, are sitting here and living in the world that we live in. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to make a comment about, you know, what you guys thought about, you know, the importance of individuals' agency in that, and how you actually bring about the you know, emancipation, I suppose that's the word you guys are using. And what does that look like in your eyes? You know, what does that emancipation mean?
Great, thanks. Liam?
Yeah, thanks, David. There's a lot of really helpful stuff there. So first of all, I would 100% agree with you that this idea that socialism is going to automatically emerge from some kind of capitalist material reality, and that we don't have to do anything about it, is absolutely not my understanding. And I don't think the understanding of historical Marxism at all. I suppose that would tie into what you were saying about agency, and why I tried to stress consciousness. So my sort of provocative point that we might not be living in capitalism as Marx understood it was related to the fact that for Marx, the consciousness of the problem was there in the time, in the workers' movement for socialism, to a certain extent. So that was more of a provocative comment about the state of the movement for socialism now. And if capitalism is not consciously recognized as harboring potential to go beyond itself by individuals in their agency, do we still live in what Marx recognized? So we do, right? Like the reality is the same, I would agree. And I would also agree that it's not going to happen automatically. But I don't know, maybe I didn't express it very eruditely. But I think it is about agency. I would say consciousness, but agency is a form of, you know, you might say they're the same thing. Yeah, so I think the problem has to be grasped consciously. And that would be the operative factor as to whether capitalism is understood as a transitory factor, a transitory category, like it was for Marx, or whether it just becomes this kind of concrete reality that we can do nothing about. I don't know. Does that answer your concerns, David?
Oh yeah, look, I'm not sure there's really an answer to it. I guess, but I guess what I was kind of thinking is, because I suppose the idea behind the platypus thing is that it's about the emancipation. So what is that? I mean, how is that different to, you know, getting towards the dictatorship, the proletariat, and, you know, the revolution, you know, all of that, the stuff that, you know, Lenin was, you know. So how is it? So are we talking about emancipation in terms of like an individualist, or more of a collective bringing about that?
Right. Sorry.
Sorry. I don't think there is like an answer to it. It's just.
No, I can definitely speak to that. I just I neglected that last part of your question. I think it's a really good one. So yeah, as I briefly mentioned, I think the dictatorship of the proletariat was understood as a necessary transitory phase to, let's say, emancipation. Now, whether we want to think of emancipation as individual or collective, I think that opposition itself might be a symptom of where we find ourselves in history. The Bourgeois Revolution that I was talking about, for example, understood itself as for the emancipation of both the individual and the collective, a transformation of this relationship, or this apparent antinomy. Emancipation beyond capitalism, I could obviously not lay out. Marx didn't. But I would say that it would involve, again, a conception of the relationship between the individual and the collective that would go beyond either term in isolation, and would be about a transformation of that relationship of each term, individual and collective, and not about one or the other. I don't know if that's an adequate answer, but is that kind of what you're asking?
I think.
And on the dictatorship of the proletariat, the idea being that the dictatorship of the proletariat would be the problem of capitalism worked through consciously, as opposed to this kind of unconscious domination that it currently is. And so that might be the only way to get to an emancipation beyond what we can even conceive of. I don't know. That's a little mystical maybe, but.
Yeah. No, I think, again, like, I don't think there's an answer to it. I guess I'm just trying to understand a bit more, like, sort of what, you know, where sort of your thinking is coming from. But I don't think I sort of take, you know, issue with that. I just just trying to understand a bit more about sort of the, you know, the interchange of words and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I'm still learning as well, but to the extent that I have a conception of emancipation, it's what I'm learning about what historical Marxism conceived of it as, which is to say, not a positive image of what a society might look like, but a negative, like a critique of what is already going on. And that involves agency, I would say. Absolutely not automatic, like you point out.
That's a great question. Do we have any more questions for Liam? While people are thinking of questions, I might just add a little more response to you, David. I think one of the points for platypus is the acknowledgement that the task of emancipation, of freedom, is actually not obvious today. It's like it is not clear for us what to do today, in a similar way to how Marx thought of a possibility to go beyond capitalism in his day, in, let's say, 1848, 1850. The active working class movements of those times showed some possibility to go beyond the crisis. Today, the problem is kind of opaque. Like it's not clear what are the tasks that confront us to further freedom, to emancipate ourselves from the kind of domination that we sometimes experience, or have a grasping that we are dominated in some ways, but we don't really have an understanding of how we're dominated. From the question from the room of 4.
Oh, hello, it's Stephen here, coming at you from the South Yarra Soviet. Anyway, Liam's presentation seemed to de-emphasize some concepts that are usually really pivotal to Marxist thought, in particular exploitation and class. Maybe, I don't know if de-emphasize is the right word, but usually that's kind of seen as the starting point. So thinking about socialism without those things being the starting point it feels a little bit alien to me. Could you say a bit more about what a Marxist framework looks like, where exploitation and perhaps class are a bit, not quite as pivotal, or not quite as the starting point as it's usually seen as, because that's probably how I would traditionally think about Marxism, that it's about exploitation and class, and that domination, as you were talking about, that domination is through exploitation and class.
That's a great question, Steve. Thank you. Yes, so I was de-emphasizing certain things, or striking a minor note, you might say, as platypus pedagogy does. I suppose the point would be to go directly to the categories you raise. And I did mention this about class briefly, but that exploitation and class in this understanding might be phenomena that are epiphenomenal, or that are byproducts of the process of domination that is capitalism. So it's not that class is the cause of capitalism, but the effect, I think, is something I said. The division of the classes and exploitation of one by the other is how this process comes to look to us, and not just like we see it wrong, it's not really there. Like, it really does come out that way. But I'd say that that is, as I say, epiphenomenal, is a result of the imperative of the process to reestablish value, that is capitalism. And so emphasizing exploitation and class is obviously something historical Marxists do, did, in a propagandistic way. Not propagandistic as in false, but propagandistic as in urging people to recognize what was going on around them so that they might overcome the crisis in total, right? But the overcoming of the crisis in total would be the overcoming of that crisis for all of society. And so the proletariat and their exploitation would be a phenomenon to be grasped critically in the service of emancipation of society as a whole from the logic that creates that condition. I don't know if I rambled a bit, but does that answer the question in any way?
Yeah, I think that helps a lot. I guess my question to that would be about the domination, as in, like, normally with domination, there's a dominator and dominated, and if we're not exclusively thinking in terms of like capitalist class exploits the working class, I mean, obviously that does happen, but if that's not the starting point, primary thing, then who's, I suppose it's a difficult question, but where's the domination coming from? I suppose history or something, but is there any way to concretize that a bit more, the source of the domination, and
100%.
And is it, yeah.
Sorry, go on. I didn't mean to cut you off. No, it should be concretized. Yeah, you're right. I did try to. So it's not that I want to affirm or posit an abstract history that's making things happen. But if we think about history, we think about domination, the domination that's operative here is that the society of labor comes into contradiction with itself after the Industrial Revolution. So I talked about unemployment. Unemployment is really key because we have this society that's supposedly based around the right of people to work and freely exchange with each other. What we have in industrial conditions is a situation where we negate this society by participating in it. And so this is the domination, that it's being built up from the ground conflict between the relations that define how this society is supposed to work and the potential which is expressed negatively in proletarianization and unemployment. The domination is brought upon ourselves, I suppose, to be super provocative. It looks like one class is doing it to another, and in a certain sense they are, and especially when we have no movement able to change that situation, it looks that way. But I think for Marxism, society itself was creating its own domination. It was not a question of the workers exploiting the, the owners exploiting the workers. Not that that isn't going on, but that might not be the thing that needs to be ultimately overcome.
Thanks, Steve.
Again, I'm
Shane?
not sure if I answered.
Oh.
I was just going to say, I don't know if that was a good answer. Thanks for the question, though, Steve. I think it's a good one.
Shane?
Yeah, I think what I'd try to emphasise in relation to that is that there's nothing new about exploitation, right? But what Marx is talking about is how what's changed. And so in terms of that, bourgeois revolution, there's still exploitation, but exploitation goes back 10,000 years, right? So there's nothing new about that process. So what he's trying to draw out is what's new about this bourgeois set of relations. And I think it's true that Platypus does focus on freedom, which tends to be a trope associated with the right. And traditionally, of course, the left's focused on exploitation for good reason, but exploitation is not new. And certainly, I think we all want to get rid of exploitation, but what's new about bourgeois social relations is a claim that it is equal and it hides, the domination is hidden. So peasants didn't matter what peasants believed or thought, they just were forced to pay to 10% of their crop to the Lord, whereas it appears at least that we go to work and I agree to work for $200 a week or whatever it is, and I get the $200 a week and I go home. So it just seems like a free exchange, doesn't it? So on the appearance of it, it appears like we're all engaged in free exchange and I'm exchanging my labour for your money. So on the face of it, there isn't any domination. So that's what we need to draw out, I think.
Yeah, thanks for that, Steve. Excuse me, Shane. Yeah, that's really helpful actually in response to your question, Steve. Like the focus on domination, I suppose, yeah, like Shane says, is about what's new and also what might harbor potential. So like exploitation between classes or castes of people, as Shane says, is nothing new. And it also doesn't necessarily point beyond itself. Whereas like the alienation, like the self-alienation of society, of capital, might harbor potential or might have for Marx.
Any more questions? I might just also comment on Shane's point, is that it's certainly true that exploitation has existed for a long time, but it's also something that every worker is conscious of, in the sense that every worker is aware that their boss makes more money than they are paid from their labor. It's not like that relationship needs a direct demystification. The question is of domination, and the domination for Marxism is a social domination, a total domination, meaning it's the worker who works fantastically in a factory, highly productive, and then there's a global depression that sends the factory out of work. And the forces that have come to shut down the factory, despite the factory being productive, are the alien dominating forces. But for Marxism, those forces, the grand market forces that have led to this depression, are the consequence of the workers' industrial production. So it's the self-estrangement, the self-alienation of their labor that comes back to negate their own labor by shutting down their factory. So it's more of the domination is not so much like the boss dominates the employee directly. It's that the labor that the worker is producing dominates all of society in an estranged form, not recognized as the productive labor that the workers seem to be doing. It now has this form of capital, like the devaluation of capital has come back to shut down the factory.
Yeah, that actually reminds me, thanks, Ryan, of something else I should have said in response to Steve's question, like exploitation and class being very real phenomenon. As Ryan says, that workers are or were or sometimes are conscious of. For, I think, historical Marxism, were emphasized and pushed. The idea being that this recognition was, if not adequate to overcoming the capitalist dynamic, would at least push the contradiction further or push the dynamic to a breaking point that would potentially bring about the dictatorship of the proletariat. So there's a complex thing going on. We don't want to just say the writings were propagandistic, but what they were an imminent critique. They were an attempt to grasp real reactions to being exploited in the service of pushing them beyond themselves. Again, I don't know if that's a little abstract, but.
Feel free to raise hands at any time. I have another question for Liam, actually. This is sort of building on what David was asking before, I think maybe in a slightly different way. Would you say that we still live in capitalism today? Would we recognize it? Could we recognize that our society has some continuity to the society that Marx was describing in the 1840s? And what would it mean to say that we are living in capitalism today?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I did very briefly say something on this. And I think it's a question that you can fall into pitfalls on. You can sound like a bit of a postmodernist if you say we don't live in capitalist anymore or something like this. I suppose, I didn't use the word dialectical in my presentation, but let's suppose that maybe Marxism took capitalism as a dialectical category. And by that, I mean a category that would only have meaning if it was in the process of change. So, I talked about the relevance of consciousness, or as David, I think, put it, agency in recognizing the problem of capitalism. To the extent that that consciousness and agency or ability to understand and change it isn't there, I think it does become a question: what society do we live under? Like, of course, on the one hand, I want to say, yes, we live in a capitalism, we go to work and unemployment happens. And so that dynamic of capitalism continues. But I would also want to stress, just the subjective factor, you know, the objectivity of the subjective, if you will. The fact that if we don't recognize the potential transitory nature of capitalism, what is it then? So it just looks like a reified kind of hellscape, which is not what Marx saw, I don't think. I don't know if that answers the question.
David, please.
Okay. Probably just a short-ish question, but I've been thinking a little bit sort of about the French Revolution as well, and sort of that, I guess you could sort of say, because that was, the French Revolution wasn't really about overthrowing, well, I guess, you know, exploitation happens throughout history, but sort of that revolution was more about, you know, overthrowing, you know, the monarchy and the feudal sort of system and that sort of thing, whilst sort of, you know, whilst Marx, I think, was looking at, you know, the Russian Revolution was sort of more about, you know, there were sort of, you know, there were kingdoms and things, but there was, I think it was more sort of aimed at the capitalist class. Like they were only able to do that because of capitalism. They're only able to have the socialists or the sort of the Marxist revolution because of capitalism. I guess kind of like the way that I think about sort of in my everyday life, how I feel like I'm exploited, whilst I go to work and my labor is exploited by my boss in a capitalist system. I mean, it kind of feels like, you know, my bosses are also playing this sort of like feudal overlord game as well. So it's like, in that way, I kind of think it's a combination. Like it's not, you know, I don't think that we live under pure capitalism. It's kind of a combination of lots of different forms of oppression and exploitation. So I'm not sure how if that sort of changes things. I guess when I think about, you know, breaking the chains, it's not just about overthrowing the capitalist system. It's about overthrowing sort of all forms of oppression of people and humanity. So I'm not sure if that is like too sort of wishy-washy or everything, or if that just kind of opens up makes things more confusing. But I don't know, does that make things different when you think about the different forms of oppression rather than just the sort of the capitalist, if you use the term capitalism, it seems a bit limiting. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful question again. Thanks. First of all, just on your first point about the bosses, I guess I would stress the compulsion that they're also under. So they do, depending on what kind of boss you mean, skim something off the top, but they're also not really in control in the way that we might analogize to feudalism, for example. They're under compulsion by the logic of society as a whole to create value, which I don't think we can say for other forms of exploitative hierarchies in the past. In terms of other kinds of oppression, I think it's a good question. Things like, let's take, for example, patriarchy. I think in capitalism, and I did hint at this when I said that modern values, what I called modern values, come to be, look like they're fulfilled and negated in bourgeois society's crisis in capitalism. Something like patriarchy, capitalism presents opportunities to overcome it while reproducing it. You could say the same about racism, perhaps. That potential for freedom along these different lines is being opened up and shut down constantly because of the dynamic as a whole in society. Because I think all these things really are symptomatic now of proletarianization. The bourgeois revolution wanted to overcome all these things. It was for free association, no matter what you looked like, anything like that. So in a way, the conception of socialism doesn't have another set of ideals beyond what the bourgeois revolution had. It's just that the situation is different. But free association and overcoming of all these kinds of crimes of oppression against each other that we do is still the goal. It's just that capitalism, like I say, both creates the potential for and undermines their overcoming. Again, I don't know how helpful that is. But...
Thanks. From the Yarra Soviet.
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks very much, Liam, for an awesome presentation. I'm Aisha. So my question is partly what you talked about, partly what Ryan said, and partly something we've been talking about in our reading group. But the question is, for Marx, part of his tasks, or his entire task, was not to create solutions for the problems people faced or to determine future destinies, but it was to understand the society in which he lived and the struggles of people. And he called for the ruthless criticism of everything existing. And so my question is, how do we begin this task of understanding the society we live in and the problems that we face? Because one of the things Ryan mentioned is that the left doesn't really know what its project is and what we should be doing. So how do we go about that process of better understanding?
Sorry, thanks, Aisha. That's a daunting question, to say the least. I don't know that I have an answer for it, Aisha, only that to say, I think once upon a time, theory and practice, or Duncan says, give us a full program in the comments. Yeah, so maybe all I'd say is once upon a time, theory and practice, or thought and action, or our ability to understand the world and our ability to change it were in more of a productive relation than they are today. And so that now, knowing what to do about the world, because of our almost total remove from our ability to change it, our ability to understand it is similarly undermined. You mentioned Marx's, ruthless critique of everything. I mean, that would be a nice start, I think. But yeah, look, what Platypus tries to do, I could say, is engage the problem at the level of ideas, at the level of the left being on the level of ideas. So, we speaking society or the left at large, we can do activism, we can do electoral projects, we can do all kinds of things. Platypus sets itself the task of clarification of the left at the level of ideas, because that's what it thinks is not sufficient, but maybe might be necessary. I hope that answers the question in some way, Aisha. Thanks.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thanks, Liam.
Maybe I'll just add one more additional point to what Liam said, was that for Platypus, there is a recognition that not only is society in the present opaque, it is not clear what possibilities there are for emancipation in the present, but there's a recognition that the existing left actually participates in the reproduction of that mystification, meaning that the pseudo activity of the left and the sort of dogmatic practices and ideas that the left participates in today actually reproduce the mystification of the present. And so it's that the immediate task that Platypus sees is the comprehension of that mystification, the reproduction of that mystification by the left, and seeks to dissolve the sort of ideological obstacles that prevent the left from actually being able to critique society, to actually be able to do a ruthless critique of the mode of production. Shane?
Yeah, I guess for me, I mean, yeah, it's always the $24 question. Is what are we going to do? I suppose for me, Platypus asking that question, the left is dead and long live the left. As someone who's come through a pretty orthodox Trotskyist kind of background, in my student days, going back 20 odd years, that for someone to be able to say, this is going to be cold comfort, but for someone to say, we don't know, is actually progress. We actually stop pretending we understand what's going on and start asking ourselves, where did we go wrong? Well, where did this go wrong? Maybe even Marx was wrong. Maybe we even need to just bite that bullet and say, maybe Marx got it wrong too, because until we're prepared to ask those questions, then we're not going to be able to move the emancipatory project forward. So for me, Platypus has always been a bit of a breath of fresh air, being prepared to say, let's ask these questions and see if we can't figure out an answer. But that's just me from my experience, of course. I'd also say too that I think Marx draws a lot more than a lot of groups realise that, Marx is interested in what the working class movement is doing. And so events like the Paris Commune and the Russian Revolution are important, not for how they worked out or what they achieved so much as to, you find Marx has a broad idea of what we need to achieve, a more democratic, egalitarian society based on the very norms that the bourgeoisie themselves have promoted, and then say what happened he doesn't actually try to start to spell it out to the Paris Commune, where he says, this is what workers tried to do when they had power. That's how we learn what it might look like, because here we can see what workers did. Otherwise, we are just, what we anticipate is that working class people will take control and run society in their own benefit, and they won't be looking to anything we write to tell them what to do about that. Otherwise they'd be looking to some other expert, wouldn't they? Not themselves.
Thanks, Shane. Yeah, I wouldn't add anything to that.
Yeah, maybe to redeem Marxism, it has to not be taken for granted. Maybe it has to be considered as a historical artifact. That's why we frame it as our reading group is about understanding what Marxism was, what the potential was, what it represented, without claiming that it has applicability today, because that would be conceding too much already. From the Soviet.
Thanks. Sorry, just one other follow-up question from me. Liam spoke about how a lot of Platypus's project is about clarifying ideas. And I guess my understanding from Marx's time was that they were not only trying to clarify ideas, but there was also a political project, which I don't feel that we really have, the left has now. So my question is, how important do you think this political project is? And is it something that we first need to clarify ideas before the left can have a cohesive political project, or do you need both at the same time?
Another great question. I'd say the political project is everything. I think, as David said right at the start of the questions, capitalism's not going to overcome itself. It's a political task. And especially for Marx after the failure of 1848, Marxism takes on almost an exclusively political preoccupation. The task is political. But like you say, what do we have now in terms of that? I wouldn't quite say that we need ideas first before we can have the political project. Like, I think, as I tried to hint at in my last answer to your last question, Aisha, I think theory and practice is a complex thing, and I wouldn't want to put any cart before any other horse, if that makes sense. Ideally, these things would be working in tandem, clarification and the real movement, which I think Marx partly could take for granted. if not take for granted, he could work with, which is what the Communist Manifesto is, right? Like taking up the existing workers' movement and seeking to clarify it and push it further. Yeah, now it looks like these things have fallen totally apart. I mean, even in the mid-20th century, you know, we read Adorno and others in Platypus that stress the falling apart of theory and practice in the mid-20th century. So this is not a new problem that we have, that these things have come apart. Maybe they've come even further apart though. But yeah, I guess to answer your question, I think it's a political task. Platypus sets itself the kind of humble task of being pre-political, but at the same time, I wouldn't say that we need ideas before we can do anything. Ideally, there would be a mutually constitutive relation.